No other individual work has had as great an influence on the apocalyptic tradition as the Book of Revelation. Its opening word, which can be translated either apocalypse or revelation, serves as a kind of self-designation. It originally described the content of the work, but eventually became the name of a kind of literature and the ideas and themes associated with it. Although its key images have precedence in Jewish literature and analogies in other early Christian writings, it is from the Book of Revelation that the popular images of Armageddon, the tribulation, the millennium, and the New Jerusalem come. These are very familiar terms in the U.S. I presume they're not unknown here. Maybe they are. In this lecture, I will place the book in its historical, social, and cultural contexts and consider its message in those contexts. So first of all, the author. The Book of Revelation claims that the proximate mediator of the revelation it contains is a man by the name of John. Since this name was not uncommon among Jews and followers of Jesus at the time, we may not simply assume that this is John the son of Zebedee, one of the 12, to whom the Gospel of John has also been attributed by Christian tradition. The author of Revelation never refers to himself as an apostle or disciple of the Lord Jesus. Justin, surnamed Martyr, one of the writing in the mid-2nd century, refers to the book and says that the author was John, one of the apostles of Christ. Irenaeus, in the latter half of the 2nd century, refers to the author of Revelation as John, the Lord's disciple. The reliability of this tradition is called into question by two factors. One is the likelihood that the work was composed in the mid-90s of the 1st century. The other is the tradition that John the son of Zebedee was killed because of his loyalty to Christ, apparently before AD 70. The author of Mark seems already to know that they were martyred. The attribution of the Book of Revelation to John the son of Zebedee, therefore, occurred either by mistake or as a way of increasing the authority of the work. The most reasonable conclusion about the authorship of Revelation is that it was written by a man named John who is otherwise unknown to us. Although John never claims to be a prophet, he describes his work as a prophecy. Further, he comes very close to designating himself as a prophet when he attributes the following words to the revealing angel in chapter 22, verse 9. I am a fellow servant with you and your brothers, the prophets. Thus, the author presented himself indirectly as a prophet, that is, as one whose task it was to mediate an intelligible message to his fellow Christians, a message that he claimed derived ultimately from God. John the prophet's intimate knowledge of Jewish scriptures and evidence that he knew Hebrew and Aramaic indicate that he was probably a Jew by birth and a native of Judea. The fact that he addressed several different communities suggests that he was an itinerant prophet, one who moved from place to place rather than a local community prophet, prophesying in each of the places he visited. His presence in Western Asia Minor and his attitude toward Rome may be explained by the hypothesis that he was a refugee from the First Jewish War with Rome, which erupted in 66 and climaxed with the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70. I turn now to the date. The earliest statement about the date of the Book of Revelation is the remark of Irenaeus that the revelation was seen at the end of the reign of the Emperor Domitian. There is no good reason, I think, to doubt this dating. Irenaeus, for example, doesn't say Domitian was a second Nero, persecuted Christians. He gets that reputation later. There is no good reason to doubt this dating, and Domitian ruled from AD 81 to 96. The most important internal evidence for the date consists of references to a city called Babylon and prophecies of its destruction. It is unlikely that the author was referring to the city in Mesopotamia or to the one in the delta of Egypt, both of which bore that name. The name is not literal but symbolic, as the statement in chapter 17, verse 5 shows. And on her forehead was written a name of mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of harlots and of the earth's abominations. The explanation of the mystery or secret in chapter 17, verses 7 to 9, makes clear that the woman represents the city of Rome. She sits on a beast with 7 heads. The heads represent 7 hills on which the woman is seated. The image of the 7 hills was widely used as a metaphor for the city of Rome by well-known writers of the first centuries BC and AD. Furthermore, the woman is identified as the great city that has royal power over all the kings of the earth. At the time John was writing, such a city could only be Rome. It is likely that John took over this symbolic name from Jewish tradition, current in his time. In ancient Jewish sources, Egypt, Kittim, Edom, and Babylon are all used as symbolic or code names for Rome. Kittim, a name that originally referred to the island of Cyprus, is the most common symbolic name for Rome in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Edom is the most common one in rabbinic literature. Most of the uses of Babylon as a symbolic name occur in Jewish apocalyptic works. In each occurrence, the reason for the use of this name is made clear in the context. It is the fact that Rome's forces, like those of Babylon at an earlier time, destroyed the city of Jerusalem and the temple. The use of the name in Jewish tradition suggests that John used it not only to allude to the great power, wealth, arrogance, and decadence of Rome, but also and most especially to call to mind the events of AD 70. But not necessarily immediately afterward. The 2 great Jewish apocalypses that react to the destruction of 70, 4th Ezra and 2nd Baruch, were not written immediately after the destruction of Jerusalem, but around AD 100. I turn now to summary of the contents. The book of Revelation opens with a preface in the 3rd person. That is, in it John does not speak, but is spoken about. It is difficult to determine whether the preface was added later by someone else, for example, when the book began to be copied and circulated, or whether John used the 3rd person here as an adaptation of the conventional introduction to prophetic works. In any case, the style and content of the preface are very similar to those of the rest of the work. The preface refers to the work as an apocalypse or revelation that was given by God to Jesus Christ to show his servants what must soon take place. This emphasis on the imminence of significant events is repeated at the end of the preface with the words, "For the time is near." The revelation was mediated in a series of steps from God to Jesus Christ, to an angel, to John, to the servants of God. This mediated character is different from the traditional Israelite prophecy, in which God speaks directly to the prophet, where the prophet somehow becomes present at the divine council. And then the prophet delivers God's words to the people with the phrase, "Thus says the Lord." The book of Revelation, however, is also called words of prophecy, and a blessing is pronounced on the one who reads it aloud, probably in a communal setting, and on those who keep or observe the things written in it. Clearly, this work represents a distinct type of prophecy in which the revelation is mediated rather than direct, and in which the prophet writes to the people rather than, or perhaps in addition to, addressing them orally. Apart from the preface, the book has the framework of an ancient letter. In this part of the work, John speaks in the 1st person and also quotes other speakers. It begins with the typical opening elements of an ancient letter. The salutation names the sender and the addressees. The greeting, in this case the wish that God and Christ grant favor and peace to the addressees, follows. Then comes a doxology, which takes the place of the thanksgiving that typically occurs near the beginning of the letters of Paul. The work closes with a concluding blessing, typical of early Christian letters. Attached to the epistolary prescript are two prophetic sayings, which hint already that this is not a typical letter. Similarly, a series of prophetic sayings precedes the epistolary conclusion. These sayings enclose what may be called the body of the work, chapter 1, verse 9 through chapter 22, verse 5. This main part is a description of the revelation received by John and an account of how and from whom he received it. The report falls into two main parts: an account of an appearance of the risen Christ to John in chapter 1, verse 9 through 322, and a description of visions and auditions of heavenly origin in 4:1 to 22:5. The second part begins with a vision of the heavenly court, which introduces a series of symbolic visions. I turn now to the question of the structure of the work. It is clear that an organizing principle in the book of Revelation is the number 7. 7 messages, 7 seals, 7 trumpets, and 7 bowls are presented. Some interpreters argue that the number is based on the observance of the Sabbath. That hypothesis seems unlikely, since the Sabbath is never mentioned in the work. John does refer to the Lord's Day in chapter 1, verse 10, which is probably Sunday. It is more likely that the number has cosmic significance. According to late Pythagorean tradition and to the Jewish exegete and philosopher Philo of Alexandria, all reality is ordered, and that order expresses itself in patterns of 7. Jewish writers argued that the observance of the Sabbath is thus in accordance with the cosmic order, but John does not make this point. It is not so clear, however, how each of the series of 7 relates to the others. They manifest parallels among themselves and some repetition. The similarities between the trumpets and the bowls are so close that the latter seem in large part to repeat the former, with just extending the destruction a bit. Some scholars think that this repetition results from the use of written sources. He just put together sources without worrying about how they fit. Others think that it's part of the author's literary design. Within the latter group, some think that the literary design involves a linear sequence of events from beginning to end, whereas others argue that the same events are described repeatedly from different points of view and with different imagery. The theory that the book of Revelation describes the same events from different points of view was adopted by the author of the oldest surviving commentary on Revelation, written about AD 300 by Victorinus of Pettau. He stated that both the trumpets and the bowls predict the eschatological punishment of unbelievers. Victorinus's hermeneutical principle of recapitulation, so repetition with a difference, was taken up by Tychonius as an independent rule in his exegetical work, 3 Books of Rules, written around AD 382. Tychonius then applied this rule in his influential commentary on the book of Revelation, written about AD 385. This commentary has unfortunately been lost, but it was so often quoted that it can be almost completely reconstructed from fragments, and something of its nature can be known from its influence on other writers. The approach to Revelation, pioneered by Victorinus, has been called the recapitulation theory in modern scholarship. The source-critical approach was first applied to the book of Revelation by Daniel Völter in 1882. An extreme source-critical analysis was proposed by Friedrich Spitta in 1889, who argued that the seals, trumpets, and bowls Each reflect a different source based on a sevenfold series. In the 20th century still, the source critical approach was adopted by M.E. Boimard, Josephine Massingbird Ford, and Ulrich B. Müller. The argument for the extensive use of sources has been undercut by the demonstration of the unity of style in the work as a whole. R.H. Charles argued that the literary design of Revelation describes a linear sequence of events. He concluded that most of the events are given in strict chronological order, but there are significant exceptions. Chapter 12, the vision of the woman and the dragon, is a flashback intended to provide the background for chapter 13, the vision of the two beasts. 3 proleptic or anticipatory visions interrupt the orderly unfolding of events in order to encourage the audience by flashing forward to some more distant point of the future. These are the vision of the innumerable multitude in the second half of chapter 7, the vision of the mighty angel in chapter 10, and the 2 witnesses in chapter 11, and the 3 visions of chapter 14. The adequacy of this theory was called into question both by these numerous significant exceptions and by the hypothesis that the text had been thrown into disarray by an incompetent disciple of the author after his death. The failure of the attempt to interpret the plan of the book as a linear sequence of events led to the revival of the recapitulation theory. Modern scholars had at first been reluctant to admit the validity of this approach because it had been used in connection with the premise that the book of Revelation prophesied history from the time of its composition to the time of the interpreter, at whatever time the interpreter lived. But Günther Bornkamm was able to show that this theory is compatible with a historical critical approach to the work. That is, with an interpretation that understands the prophecies to refer to the past and present of the author, and apart from that, to the eschatological future, which was future for John and for later the modern interpreter as well. Bornkamm pointed out the close parallel structure between 2 major parts of the body of the work. He argued that the 7 seals, 7 trumpets, and related material describe the same series of events as the 7 bowls and the related material that follows. The part beginning with the seals, however, describes these events in a mysterious, fragmentary, and proleptic manner. Another way of retrieving the recapitulation theory is to argue that the book of Revelation consists of 2 great cycles of visions, one from 1:9 to the end of chapter 11, and the other from the vision of the woman clothed with the sun to the end of the account of the New Jerusalem. The first cycle is made up of 3 series of 7, the messages, seals, and trumpets. The second is made up of a series of unnumbered visions, which you can interpret as 7, but that might be stretching it a bit. 7 bowls and another series of unnumbered visions. Beginning with the 7 seals, each series expresses the message of the whole book in its own particular way. The constant elements of the message are 3 themes: persecution, punishment of the persecutors, and salvation of the persecuted. These themes are introduced in the first cycle in a way that seems deliberately veiled and fragmentary, just hinting at this phenomenon, or a series of 3 phenomena. The second cycle maintains the symbolic and mythic language of the first, but presents the message of the book in a fuller and more coherent manner. In particular, the second cycle is more explicit about the historical contexts of the visions. The first cycle makes clear that persecution is of major importance, but it is only in the second cycle that the identity of the persecutors is made almost explicit, namely the Roman authorities. Structural, thematic, and text-linguistic approaches have also been offered. Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza discerned a pattern of inclusion, the rhetorical and literary concept of an inclusio, two similar things, enclosing material in between, inclusion or symmetry in the book of Revelation. She defines the introductory material before the beginning of the account of the appearance of the risen Christ as the first unit of the work. The last unit, most, but not all, of the prophetic sayings that follow the end of the body of the work, chapter 22, verses 10 to 21, forms the seventh and last unit. In her view, these two units are related as promise and fulfillment. The second unit is the account of the appearance of Christ, including the seven messages. The sixth unit includes the material from the coming of Christ on a white horse and some of the concluding prophetic sayings in chapter 22. The second and sixth unit are related because they both contain what she calls an inaugural vision of Christ, the opening epiphany and the eschatological coming. The third unit begins with the throne vision and ends with the sixth trumpet. The fifth unit includes the bowls and the following related material. These two are related because both evolve out of the scroll with the seven seals. Only the trumpets, however, are explicitly connected with the scroll, because the opening of the seventh seal involves two or three phenomena, one of which is the beginning of the trumpets, the appearance of seven angels with trumpets. But you don't get any kind of literary connection like that between 11 and 12. That leaves the fourth unit, which consists of the visions of the mighty angel and the two witnesses, the seventh trumpet, the woman clothed with the sun, the two beasts, and the miscellaneous visions of chapter 14. She argues that this unit is the center and climax of the book. In his text-linguistic study of Revelation, David Hellholm concluded that the level of communication most profoundly embedded in the work is the speech of God that follows the descent of the New Jerusalem from heaven. This speech also occurs on the highest grade of the hierarchy of text sequences. He argued that this hierarchic embedment of divine speech enhances the authority of the message. I turn now to social setting and purpose. The messages to the seven congregations in the seven cities reveal conflict among the followers of Jesus in these regions and rivalry among their leaders. Each message is addressed to the angel of the congregation in that particular city. Since angels were equivalent to stars in Jewish tradition, and the angels of the congregations are identified with stars in chapter 1, verse 20, it is clear that John refers to angelic beings in 2:1 and the other messages, not to human messengers. This motif is a democratization of the Israelite and Jewish idea that each people or nation, partial democratization, of the Israelite and Jewish idea that each people or nation has an angel ruling over it as representative and patron. At the same time, however, the address to the angel is a literary device through which the author can address the community as a whole, speaking in the name of Christ. It may be that the author employed this device in order to circumvent the institutional leaders of the congregations, bishops or overseers, elders and deacons, and to lessen their authority. The charismatic authority of the prophet may bypass the institutional authority of the local leaders, just in case they're not on board. The Christians in Ephesus are commended because they cannot bear evil people, but have tested those who call themselves apostles but are not, and found them to be false. They are also praised for hating the works of the Nicolaitans, which Christ also hates. In the message to the followers of Jesus in Pergamum, the teaching of the Nicolaitans is equated with that of Balaam. As you know, according to Numbers 22 to 24, Balaam was a foreign priest and diviner, or seer, whom Balak, the king of Moab, paid to curse Israel. Moved by the power of the Lord, however, Balaam blessed Israel instead. But the book of Revelation seems to allude not to these mostly positive accounts about Balaam, but to Numbers 31:16, which says that Balaam counseled the women of Midian to cause the people of Israel to act treacherously against the Lord in the matter of Peor. This text, in turn, alludes to the story in Numbers 25, 1-18, according to which some of the men of Israel married women of Moab and Midian, who then persuaded them to worship their god, Baal of Peor. The teaching attributed to Balaam that some in Pergamum are accused of holding involves eating food sacrificed to idols and practicing immorality. It is not entirely clear whether either or both of these activities are meant literally or metaphorically. The eating of food, probably meat sacrificed to idols, is an issue addressed by Paul in 1 Corinthians chapters 8 to 10. It could very well be meant literally here. Practicing probably sexual immorality could also be meant literally, but in some restricted sense regarding distinctions between permitted and forbidden types of marriage. It's hard to imagine an early Christian teacher saying, go forth and commit adultery or fornication or what have you. If the terms are taken literally, the controversy here may be related to the so-called apostolic decree reported in Acts 15:29. Another possibility is that both terms are meant to symbolize laxness in monotheistic devotion to the one true God. Harlotry is a term used frequently in the prophetic books of the Jewish scriptures for honor paid to other gods. In either case, the point at issue seems to be how to live as a servant of God and a follower of Jesus in a pluralistic society. In antiquity, as you know, there was no concept of a secular state. Religious, social, economic, and political aspects of life were closely intertwined and embedded in politics, in each other. John evidently disagreed with some traveling and local teachers in Ephesus and Pergamon on this question. The issue is even more explosive in the message to Thyatira. The Christians in that place are criticized for tolerating the woman Jezebel. As Babylon is a symbolic name for the city of Rome, so Jezebel is a code name for a female prophet active in Thyatira. According to the first book of Kings, Jezebel was the daughter of the king of Sidon and a worshiper of Baal. Ahab, the king of Israel, the northern kingdom, married her, presumably to form an alliance with Sidon. Ahab then built a temple for Baal in Samaria. A struggle then followed between the devotees of Baal and those of Yahweh. In the end, Jezebel was thrown from a window and her body eaten by dogs. John's endowment of the otherwise anonymous prophet with the name Jezebel is already a harsh commendation of her teaching. It is described in the same way as that of Balaam, practicing immorality and eating food sacrificed to idols. The words attributed to Christ hint that her teaching also involved the deep things of Satan. This phrase could be understood to mean that her teaching was similar to Gnostic speculation, or that she was involved in the practice of magic. It could, however, simply mean that she taught apocalyptic mysteries, that is, secrets about heaven or the future. These could be revealed interpretations of texts that she associated with Satan, or the evil angels associated with him. Such teaching would be intelligible entirely within the context of Jewish and Christian apocalypticism. But we do not have sufficient information to be sure what this teaching was. The messages also reflect a social setting in which followers of Jesus are in conflict with their Jewish neighbors. Although the movement that originated with the historical Jesus could still be defined as a type of Judaism at the time John was writing, even from a modern scholarly point of view, it is likely that some social differentiation had taken place. The use of the term ecclesia, assembly, congregation, or church, in the book of Revelation indicates that followers of Jesus in each city had their own association, separate from the synagogue, the gathering or the synagogue, the assembly of the local Jewish community. In the message to Smyrna, the speaker refers to the slander of those who say that they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Those who say that they are Jews and are not could be Jewish people or Christians following a Jewish way of life. They could, for example, be Gentiles by birth who argue that those who would share in the benefits of Christ must be circumcised and observe all or some of the commandments of the Torah. This line of interpretation seems unlikely, however, since John shows no interest in the theological principles dear to Paul, such as salvation by faith rather than by works of the law. Furthermore, the rhetorical force of the saying implies that Jews is a positive designation. The implication is that the ecclesia, the association of followers of Jesus, is the synagogue of God, and that the local Jewish community, which does not recognize Jesus as the Messiah, is the synagogue of Satan. Now, this text obviously is a very dangerous text for later contexts in which it could be, and I'm sure has been used in an anti-Semitic way. But it's typical polemic at the time, even an inner Jewish polemic. It's analogous to the polemic of the sectarian movement associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls against other Jews who have not joined them in their new covenant with the Lord and the proper interpretation of the Torah that has been revealed to them. For example, the community rule states, "They shall separate from the congregation of the men of falsehood and shall unite with respect to the law and possessions under the authority of the sons of Zadok, the priests who keep the covenant, and of the multitude of the men of the community who hold fast to the covenant." The men of falsehood are equivalent to the men of the lot of Belial. So Belial is the chief of all evil spirits and demons, so equivalent to Satan. The similarity is especially strong in a passage from the Thanksgiving hymns, where the probably Jewish opponents of the community are designated, quote, "a council of deceit and a congregation of Belial," unquote. Immediately following the reference to the synagogue of Satan in Revelation 2:9, the author gives encouragement in the face of persecution. John uses the word tribulation to speak of the sporadic persecutions that have already happened and continue to occur, and for the persecutions that he expects to happen in the future. In the message to Smyrna, the speaker says, "Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and for 10 days you will have tribulation. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life." These words imply expectation of official arrest and imprisonment, presumably to await trial. At the time John was writing, and for more than a century afterwards, Roman officials did not seek out Christians to arrest and interrogate them. They took action only when a citizen or a resident with civil rights brought an official accusation or charge against Christians in accordance with the normal legal process. The juxtaposition of a polemic about the synagogue of Satan and the encouragement in the face of persecution suggests that in Smyrna, conflict between Christians and Jews had led or seemed about to lead to the formal accusation of Christians by Jews before the Roman authorities. The charge could have been disturbing the peace or introducing a new cult, which almost by definition would be unlawful or subversive. The message to the congregation in Philadelphia also mentions a synagogue of Satan, and those who say that they are Jews and are not, but lie. The promise in this message that those who claim to be Jews will come and bow down before the feet of the congregation and know that Christ has loved them expresses the hope for a reversal of the present situation in which the Christian congregation has little or no status or power, not even from their fellow Jews, so to speak, as John viewed it. The need to endure and the need to avoid denying the name of Christ are prominent themes in the messages. These themes reflect a social situation in which it is difficult to maintain the identity of the group in light of the dominant symbolic system and lifestyle, and in which there is active opposition to Christian communities. The messages reveal tensions between Christians and non-Christian Jews. It is likely that there were tensions between Christians and non-Christian Gentiles as well. As I already noted in discussing the date of the book of Revelation, the work manifests great antipathy to Rome because of the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. Another point of potential conflict was the Imperial Cult. This issue begins to emerge in chapter 12. The revelatory report in chapter 12 consists of a vision with 3 scenes and an audition that interprets the second scene of the vision. The first and third scenes constitute a birth narrative in which a superhuman female figure gives birth to a son with a heroic or divine destiny. A great monster threatens mother and son, but the mother receives divine aid and the child is saved. This narrative has similarities with several types of ancient texts and roots in the Hebrew Bible as well, but it is most similar to a group of stories about Leto, a Titan goddess, giving birth to Apollo in spite of the pursuit of Python, a monster who rightly fears that Apollo will take his place as ruler of Delphi and its oracle. During the early period of the Roman Empire, Roman rule was likened to the golden age of Apollo. Think of Virgil's 4th Eclogue. And various emperors were identified as Apollo manifest or incarnate. John co-opts this imperial propaganda to claim that the true golden age will come with the messianic reign of Christ. Immediately following the vision of the mother and her child is the vision of a beast rising out of the sea. This vision is a rewriting and adaptation of the vision of the 4 beasts from Daniel 7. At the end of the vision that precedes that of the beast, the monster who threatened the woman, a great dragon, is shown standing on the sand by the sea. It is implied that the dragon watches or even summons the beast rising from the sea. The implication is that the beast is the agent of the dragon. This impression is confirmed by the statement that the dragon gave the beasts its power, its throne, and great authority. Another statement in the vision of the beast reinforces the point. People worshipped the dragon because he had given his authority to the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast, and who is able to make war with it?" Since the dragon is identified with Satan in chapter 12, verse 9, the beast is presented as an ally or agent of Satan. In the original context of Daniel 7, the 4 beasts represented the Babylonian Empire, the Medes, the Persians, and the Greeks. The Jewish historian and client of the Flavian emperors, Josephus, provides evidence that the 4th beast was understood to be Rome in the 1st century AD. That the beast of Revelation represents Rome is clear. Authority was given to it over every tribe and people and tongue and nation. Rather than describe 4 beasts, each more terrible than the last, John has combined the attributes of all 4 to create one overwhelmingly monstrous creature. The result is a reduction of attention to history and a focus on the terrors of the recent past and the present. The vision of the beast from the sea makes clear what the dominant concerns of John are. Like the beasts of Daniel 7, this beast, that is Rome, is portrayed as rebelling against God and thus becoming an adversary of God. This theme is invoked by the very image of the sea monster. It is made explicit by the motif of the blasphemous names upon its head and the mouth uttering haughty and blasphemous words. This theme reaches its climax in the statement, "It opened its mouth to utter blasphemies against God, blaspheming his name and his dwelling," that is, those who dwell in heaven. So far, the language of conflict is symbolic or mythic, but then it becomes clear that the conflict has a historical dimension. Also, it was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them. This statement may be understood in two ways. It reflects the incidents of persecution that have already taken place. For example, the execution of Antipas, mentioned in the message to Pergamon. It also reflects the persecution that John expects to occur in the future. It probably also refers to the first Jewish war with Rome, which began during the reign of Nero. The Roman forces were at first under the command of the military leader Vespasian, until he was proclaimed emperor. His son Titus then took over the command. It was he who led the siege of the Temple Mount, and under whose command the temple was burned and the city largely destroyed. Later he succeeded his father as emperor. Thus the Romans made war on the saints and conquered them. Here the saints are the people of God. In Daniel 7, the saints or holy ones are angels, and the people are the people of the saints of the Most High. The blasphemous names and haughty or blasphemous words evoke not only rebellion, but also the imperial cult. Worship of the living emperor was not a typically Roman phenomenon, but was popular in the East. In the cultures of Mesopotamia and Egypt, it was traditional to view the king or pharaoh as a deity manifest or incarnate. The Greeks had a tradition of honoring the special dead with hero cults, and of honoring living benefactors with religious rituals. When Alexander the Great conquered the Near East, he accepted and apparently even encouraged the peoples he ruled to give him divine honors. His successors did the same. Various ruler cults appeared among the Greeks during the Hellenistic period. When Roman hegemony was established in the Eastern Mediterranean area, various cities established cults in which divine honors were given to Roma and Augustus, and then various other emperors and their families, often while they were still alive. It is clear that these cults had important social and political functions. They expressed gratitude to Rome for creating social and political stability, and were part of a system of benefaction and patronage. Simon Price has argued that the imperial cult in the Hellenistic cities resulted from the attempt by Greek subjects of the Roman Empire to relate their ruler to their own dominant symbolic system. The imperial cult was a ubiquitous and impressive phenomenon in the Roman province of Asia, in which the 7 cities of Revelation were located. No resident could overlook it. The cult was celebrated not only in temples, but also in the major civic centers, the meeting place of the council, the theater, the stadium, and the gymnasium. The emperor was regularly associated with the traditional gods, and sometimes presented as a god himself. For example, gold was normally used only for statues of the gods, but it was also often used for those of emperors. Images of the emperors were often carried in processions. Finally, many of the coins in use carried the portrait of the emperor, often depicted as Zeus, Apollo, or Hercules. John's disapproval of the imperial cult is displayed in the statement that all who dwell on earth will worship the beast, everyone whose name has not been written before the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb that was slain. In the account of the Last Judgment, it is said, if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. To conclude, The book of Revelation is not a prediction of the timing of the end of the world. It is a work of religious poetry, inspired by the prophets of Israel and by the cosmic and political myths of old and of the author's time. The author, an early Christian prophet by the name of John, believed himself authorized by God and his Messiah to interpret the times for his contemporaries. His message was harsh and demanding, both for insiders and outsiders. Insiders were to avoid compromise with the corrupt and idolatrous culture of the cities of the province of Asia, no matter what the cost. John envisaged some chance for the repentance and conversion of outsiders, but for the most part, outsiders were expected to continue doing evil and to be condemned to eternal torment or perhaps annihilation in the lake of fire. The book of Revelation is also a work of religious rhetoric, intended to shape the beliefs and lifestyle of its audience. Historically speaking, it may have contributed to the survival of a Christian perspective that could not simply take its place as one cult among many. Theologically and ethically speaking, it is a work that expresses the anguish of those who live on the margins. It expresses a vision of hope for the marginalized themselves and makes vivid and intelligible for the comfortable how the world of power relations looks from a perspective on the margins. Thank you for your attention.
Once again, we start our questions and remarks with the younger generation present here. Any questions?
My name is Olga, and I'm also in my second year of studies, and I've had this question about symbolic and code names. I was interested what was a need or the base for renaming Rome by those different four names of other regions, because I don't quite understand, was it like some maybe euphemistic nature, or how did they come to an idea that we can't say Rome in this text, but we would prefer to name it Egypt or Kitim or Edom?
Thank you. Yes. One old theory is that the author and audience were afraid to write Rome in this text because they could be arrested and killed for insulting Rome. That seems to me unlikely, because if a member of the Roman authorities read this text, it would be obvious it's talking about Rome. I almost said Russian, yes. The Roman authorities, it would be clear they were talking about Rome. I think it's more a way of making the work more mysterious and therefore engaging the reader more deeply. I think Mark does that too with the messianic secret, the mystery of the kingdom of God. You know, if you create something mysterious, it makes it more interesting than if you just tell a straightforward story. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
I also have a question. My name is Dasha, and like all of my friends, I'm in my second year. And I wanted to ask if there was a point in your lecture when you said the tradition is at least predominantly written, but might have been additionally being translated orally. And I was wondering if there is any evidence so that we can speak of a potential influence of some oral tradition on the Book of Revelation in particular and apocalyptic genre as a whole.
Yes. Yes, I didn't mean so much that there's previous oral tradition that the author drew on in writing this work. What I meant to allude to was, it seems from the messages that John knows these communities rather well. And as I indicated, he was an itinerant prophet. I think he visited those communities. And he wasn't the first one to come as an apostle or prophet. There were established communities, but as Paul says, he wants to go to Rome to contribute something to their faith and to learn from them. So I think John traveled to these cities and proclaimed maybe prophetic sayings orally, or proclaimed, I don't think we have evidence for what he said exactly, but it must have been compatible with this text. And that his reason for writing was in part because he was forced to be on Patmos. I think, he says, I was in Patmos, I forget now the term he uses exactly, but with the accusative. And some people say, well, he went there to proclaim the gospel. That seems unlikely. There wasn't a big major city on Patmos at the time. So that's what I meant.
Okay. Any other questions?
My name is Anthony, or Anton in Russian. I'm professor of New Testament in one of theological universities here in Moscow. It would be interesting, not only for me, for us in general, to know your opinion or your considerations, maybe concerning the newest commentaries on the Book of Revelation. I mean the commentary of Craig Koester, or German commentary of Klaus Berger, and the first book of commentary of Martin Karel.
Yes. Yes.
What's your opinion, your assessment of this?
I haven't, I'm not familiar with Berger's commentary, but I think Karel's is excellent. And of course, he's a text critic, and Revelation has very particular text critical problems. But I think he has good critical judgment and good sensitivities as well. Craig Koester agrees with me a lot, so I love his commentary. And he is also looking at social, religious, political context, and trying to understand the images in that context, so he has a lot of new stuff too. Do you have some opinions about them?
I read the commentary of Berger. It's, my opinion is has too many facts that, so to speak, have nothing to do with the text of Revelation itself. Too many words, many ideas too, but too many. It's absolutely unbearable to read such an enormous, massive text.
You could say the same about David Ani's commentary. He put in everything that relates somehow, and it would have been helpful if he'd edited it down. But when one finishes, the last thing you want to do is go through and edit. But, anyway, thank you.
So thank you very much.
I also have a little question. My name is Ksenia. I'm also a second-year student here. It may seem silly, but when you were talking about the community of Smyrna, the conflict between the followers of Jesus and the Jews who worshipped Satan, it wasn't really clear to me who actually were those followers of Jesus. I mean, ethnically. Were they Jews, or were they Jews and some other people?
You mean the ones in, not John's community, the other one, the synagogue, the synagogue?
No, the ones, I don't know.
Well, the cities of Western Turkey, which were part of the province
I looked it up.
of Asia at the time, those cities had been, first of all, deeply Hellenized, well, founded by Greeks, some of them. And so there was an educated elite who spoke Greek. And then they were also Romanized. And they, the big cities, Smyrna and Pergamum and Ephesus, they rivaled each other in their offering honor to Rome. And they all wanted, you know, temples and other ways of honoring the emperor and the city of Rome. So they were, I guess, possibly a mix of local peoples and Greeks, but they had a strong, you know, in antiquity, to be a Greek, it didn't matter what your ethnicity was, it mattered what you spoke, what your culture was. So I guess it's fair to say they were Greek. Now, did you want to know, was there something different about the group that John called the Synagogue of Satan?
Especially taking into account how the expression fared later, it would be interesting to think about the ethnic composition of those to whom this expression was first applied.
Yes, yes, the Seleucids encouraged Jews to come settle in Asia Minor when they were in control politically of that region, because they would be loyal to the king. But others went of their own accord, you know, for business, trade, and so forth. So a lot of them were ethnically Judean, probably. But how many generations had they been there? You know, probably quite a few. So in a sense, they were also Greek. They lived a Jewish way of life, but they were also culturally and thus, in ancient terms, ethnically Greek.
Okay, and John calling those synagogue of Satan, it actually seemed to me that he meant that all the Jews should worship Jesus.
Yes.
And this is kind of the thing that doesn't really come together in my mind, because, like, I don't really understand this.
Yes,
yet.
well, there are debates about New Testament texts, and there's a debate now. Take Matthew, for example. Jesus, and you can infer from the text later, his followers went to synagogues and tried to get the Jews to accept Jesus as the Messiah. And largely that attempt failed. And then at the end of Matthew, the risen Jesus appears and says, go and proclaim the gospel to all nations, pantata ethne. And some people say, well, that means Gentiles, not Jews. The mission to the Jews is over, they rejected it, we turn away from them. I think normally ta ethne means the Gentiles. And I think pantata ethne means including the Jews. To every ethnic group, to everybody in the inhabited world. And Paul, you know, Paul in Romans 9-11 says a hardening has come on Israel. So he's aware that the mission to the Jews has failed. But he expresses hope that somehow God will bring them in before the end. And there's a huge debate now whether that means Paul is confident that they will eventually recognize Christ as a Messiah and thus be part of the eschatological people of God, or, as some scholars argue, there are two covenants, and Israel will enter the kingdom of God as Jews with their own Torah covenant, and Christians will join in their way. Now, personally, I think that is how we should think now. I think Christians should not try to convert the Jews. You know, that's insulting to them. And they are very offended by it. You know, that they have, you know, a very ancient connection with the God of Israel, who's the same God that Christians worship. So we should not have a mission to Jews. But I don't think that's what Paul thought. I think Paul thought they should and would somehow come to accept Christ. But God would have to do it because the missionaries can't. They're failing. So,
Okay, thank you.
yeah.
No questions? I have a very basic and silly question, which in fact I had when I first read the book of Revelation. It was many, many years ago. Since that time I read a lot of literature on the Bible, but still this question is there. When you read, of course, when you read the New Testament, there are a lot of passages which have some eschatological ring. In Gospels, of course, in Mark and Matthew, and then we have eschatological ideas and passages in Paul. But still, when one gets to the book of Revelation, it's in some sense like moving from one world to a different world with all that fantastic beasts and so on and so on and so on, which makes this book in fact much closer to the Jewish apocalyptic tradition, to what we see in pseudepigrapha, a bit more closer to that tradition, more alien with regard to the other books of the New Testament canon. Can we imagine that there was a tradition of such apocalypses like the revelation to John that existed in the early Christianity, and was just by pure chance to have only one example of this literature? Or it is really an exception?
So when you say it's alien to the other books of the New Testament, you mean only in form, only in genre?
Yes, I would like to say in form, in genre, in imagery.
Yeah. Well, I think the imagery of the book and its presentation belongs to the genre.
Yeah.
It's because, you know, the imagery, the mythic patterns, the narrative patterns, that's all belongs to the apocalyptic.
But it's different from what we call little apocalypses in Mark or Matthew,
Yeah.
from by genre and by imagery.
Yeah, I would call Mark 13 and parallels an eschatological discourse. It's prophecy. It's a scholastic dialogue expanded into an eschatological discourse, but it's not an apocalypse. Jesus is not mediating revelation. He's the source of it. Seems to be. So, were there other Christians?
That's good.
Now we don't know that there was anything before John. I think John was a native Palestinian, and that he fled Palestine because of the Jewish war. And I think there were probably other refugees in Asia Minor who fled the disruption, fled Jerusalem. So he was learned. He knows the scriptures by heart, and he no doubt knows Daniel. There's only one hint that he knows the Enoch literature. He has that one passage at the end of chapter 14, and the blood, well, it's a vintage. It starts out as a vintage of grapes, and it ends up with battle imagery, that the blood will be to the horses' bridles. You get that same image in First Enoch. So maybe he knows, I don't think he knows previous Christian apocalypses necessarily, but he knows perhaps a living apocalyptic tradition out of which both 4th Ezra and 2nd Baruch grow. Were written almost the same time. And all three of them have, especially 4th Ezra and Revelation, they are not just writing an apocalypse, but they're consolidating tradition. you know, you have prophetic eschatology in the 1,000-year reign on earth, fulfillment of the promises for ruling, that the Jews will rule the world, and possibly fertility and so on, but that's not stated. And then you have an absolutely new heaven and earth and a new age. So those are two different types of eschatology, and both 4th Ezra and the author of Revelation and John combine them by creating a sequence from one to the next.
My question was, in fact, somehow dealing with how do we understand the early Jesus movement?
Yeah.
Because we have this uninterrupted apocalyptic tradition which began much earlier than Jesus movement, and which was continued through the revelation of John and 2nd Baruch and 4th Ezra and so on and so on. Is it a sort of a late, the Apocalypse of John, is it sort of a late newcomer within the Jesus movement? Or we may suppose that something like this, text like this, circulated in the early Jesus movement even before?
I would think oral tradition. I think Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet, and so was John the Baptist. So that when Jesus proclaimed the kingdom of God, he was proclaiming a radical divine intervention into history and the created world as it was at the time. And he didn't focus on what would be, he didn't describe that in detail, because he was trying to get, both John and Jesus were trying to get people to get ready for this divine intervention by repenting, confessing their sins, and by forming a congregation of people who would be pleasing to God, righteous people and obedient people. So, and part of that, you know, Jesus was, I don't think Jesus thought he himself was a Messiah, or I don't think he claimed to be, but the best way, I think, to understand the Son of Man tradition in the New Testament is to posit an oral tradition that goes back to Jesus. But that he didn't necessarily identify himself with that Son of Man, but he talked about the human figure of Daniel 7 is coming. And that is the way the divine intervention will take place, a Messiah. But it's not going to be a Messiah like the Psalms of Solomon. It's not going to be a human warrior and teacher. It's going to be a heavenly figure.
Yes, I completely agree with you that obviously the eschatological ideas were there from the very beginning.
Yes.
But at least what we see in the canonical Gospels and the oral tradition we can reconstruct behind the canonical Gospels, both in genre and in imagery, it's completely different world from what we see in the Revelation.
Well, you know, some people have tried to argue, okay, Jesus was a wisdom teacher, he was like a cynic philosopher, he was witty and ironic, and Mark is the one who introduced apocalyptic tradition. But although, you know, this is Burton Mack who argued this and others too, but the way we reconstruct Q, there are a lot of prophetic and apocalyptic sayings in Q. And so people who believe in this wisdom Jesus want to say, okay, Q had a history. There was a time when Q was only wisdom sayings, and then later, when the mission of the followers of Jesus was failing and they got frustrated, then they added apocalyptic prophetic sayings. Well, I think that's one example of a typical aversion to apocalyptic perspectives and tradition. People want to save Jesus from apocalypticism, they want to save Paul, you know, so they want to say only Revelation is truly apocalyptic. But I think Q shows that you could put together aphoristic sayings and apocalyptic predictions and prophetic sayings. Even Thomas, the Gospel of Thomas, has some Son of Man sayings which are reinterpreted in a non-apocalyptic way, but it knows that tradition. And Paul, I think, knew the Son of Man tradition, but he doesn't use that phrase because it's so Semitic. He doesn't think his Greek-speaking Gentiles would get it, so he uses kurios instead of hakuios to anthropou. But he's got 1 Corinthians 15, 1 Thessalonians 4. It's very similar to what you get in Mark 13 and in parts of Revelation. So.
Good, thank you. Any more questions?
Let me continue the previous question. You see that from the Gospel we have very different image of our Savior, of Jesus Christ. He is not an eschatological warrior like in Revelation, and it is very difficult to combine the imagery of Gospels, a very peaceful Messiah, with Apocalypse, with the Book of Revelation.
What about the woes against the cities of Galilee in Matthew, and the woes against the scribes and Pharisees in Matthew 23? But I think I agree that on the whole, Jesus is not messianic in the Synoptic Gospels, at least. And although they use the term messianic language a lot, but he's not a warrior and he's not a king. But look what happens in contemporary Jewish tradition.
And in John as well, he isn't.
Well, he has a kingdom.
Yeah.
My kingdom is not of this world, but he has a kingdom. And eventually he's going to rule the earth as well as heaven. But anyway, I think that, in the Jewish war, there was first Menachem, who was proclaimed a king, and then Simon, son of Giora, was claimed a king. So they were, after Menachem was killed, Simon became the Messiah for that revolutionary movement. And he was executed in Rome as, he was led in triumph as the king who was defeated by the Romans. And that's it. Because he was killed, he failed. He's not remembered as the Messiah by any Jewish group. So the followers of Jesus had a problem. He was killed in an even more, well, of course, that hadn't happened yet at the time Jesus was killed. But that was the most disgraceful way anybody could die at that time, was to be crucified. And so you'd expect they'd just forget about him. He's not, well, we thought he was the Messiah, but he isn't. But they didn't. And the way they solved that problem is he was not a king and warrior kind of Messiah. He was a heavenly Messiah. And Paul even says in Romans, the beginning of Romans, he was appointed Messiah by the Holy Spirit through his resurrection. So that's how I think people put it together.
But the problem is still there, I think.
Yeah. Well, it gives you a rich picture of Jesus. He has many facets.
Yeah.
Thank you, Adela, for your presentation, and thank you for the discussion after your presentation, which also introduced all of us to the problems of the new quest for historical Jesus that we launched.
Thank you for
here.
your question. That was great.
Thank you.